Okay, so fires and firefighting in Aldbourne from 1760 to 2021. I've got the older part. I'll be talking about 1760 to 1777. So let me go there. Right, so let me set a bit of context first of all. 1760, who was on the throne? George II. But he died in October of 1760. He was the last British monarch to lead his troops into battle. So that's a bit of an interesting one. But he didn't take much interest in domestic policy. We were at war with the French again. That doesn't really cut it down. So I'll say it's the 7 Years' War, which was a bit of a world war. We were fighting them in India, Europe, Ireland, and North America. In 59, General Wolfe had taken Quebec. So in 1760, we'd just gained control of Montreal, bringing pretty much all of Canada at that time under our control. We'd already got America under our control. So this was the first British Empire, really. Although they didn't know it at the time, this set in train a whole set of processes which led fairly inevitably to the American independence. But at this point, everyone was feeling jolly happy with themselves. They suddenly found themselves a huge empire. So closer to home, what do we know about the 1760 fire? Well, the Victoria County history tells us some things. 72 houses were lost. Warehouses and looms were destroyed. Malt houses and brew houses were destroyed. The market cross was restored after the fire, which is sort of interesting. That suggests that somehow, maybe the fire had got closer to it. Maybe the green hadn't been the size it was. But the market, which had been revived due to the fustian trade, didn't carry on after 1760. There are long-term impacts of the fires. So why are we talking about this now? We've talked about fires before. Well, earlier this year, Alan came up with, I believe he got it from Chippenham. Alan, is that right? I'll look at you. You're muted, but you can nod. Yep, he's nodding. Yes, he came up with this document that he managed to get from Chippenham, which is an account of the monies expended for building and wearing apparel for the sufferers of the fire at Aldbourne, 1760. Now, anyone who knows me, I cannot handle accounts normally. I think they're the dullest thing on earth. But this file got my interest because there's all sorts of little details that we can pull out of this. So that's what we're going to do. And I ended up transcribing it all. We will put a copy of that transcription up on the website at some point this week when I'm not doing video editing. We probably can't put the images up because I suspect they're copyright of Chippenham. But we'll show you various snippets here and now. So spelling, of course, 1760, Johnson's dictionary had only been published 5 years prior, and spellings were more phonetic and certainly more variable. So there we get wearing apparel is ARE, huts has 2 T's, blankets has 2 T's, and Lydiard Tregois is Lydiard Tregoose, which I rather like. You have to get your eye in on this, but these accounts were produced at the end, written up as a fair copy, so at least they are one hand all the way through. Of course, they're using pounds, shillings, and pence, but mostly in this sort of form with the quotation marks between the numbers, which makes it horrible to type out. So £3, 15 shillings and 4p has quote marks, but they weren't entirely consistent, even in one set of accounts. In other places, you get it with dashes. You don't get the slashes, which is what I just about almost remember. How they wrote things is a bit different as well. Capital Fs are actually represented as 2 Fs when you look at them. And the E's are distinctly weird. So that at the top is a capital F for fire, and that character at the end is an E. Lower down, the R on pair is very much one that I recognize from my mum's writing, but probably teenagers these days wouldn't have seen that style of writing. Although when I was working, a lot of our Indian colleagues still wrote that way. Capitalization, a pair, capital P, of shears, capital S, needles, capital N, very much more like the German is now, where all nouns are capitalized. The US Constitution of 1787 is much the same, that it uses capitalization quite liberally. So that's an interesting variation now. And yeah, we get all sorts of variation, of course. So top of the first page on the inside. And so we've got a date at the top, September the 12th, 1760. It's not the date that any one of the things was received, because that got that beneath September the 13th. And although it doesn't say it explicitly, I think this, we can be, there's a sort of 95% probability that the fire was on September the 12th, 1760, which would have been a Friday. What's particularly impressive is that although we don't see the original notes, within a day, they are starting to collect money. And there was, we can suspect that there was a group of people doing it. We know that in later fires, you'd get a committee set up. Now, for them to do that, it sort of suggests that they knew it from elsewhere. There was a known pattern for doing it, because you wouldn't just come up with how to do it quickly. So very impressive that how quickly they got going on this. So immediate spending, the pages in this go, you get a page of spending and then a page of receipts, page of spending, page of receipts. So we can see here, September the 13th, instantly we've got paying 20 men for watching at 18 pence each. Now, what could they be watching? I think the only logical conclusion is that they were watching all the embers and making sure it didn't burst into life again. So you've got 20 men on the 13th, you've got 12 men on the 14th, with a single man from Ramsbury. I would point out that the man from Ramsbury seems to be getting a bit of a bottom deal. He's getting paid 6pence, whereas 12 men from Aldbourne are getting paid 12 shillings in total, so 12 a shilling each. So it seems like we were paying Aldbourne folk twice as much as someone from Ramsbury. That antipathy goes back. And even further on, we get on the 15th, we've got 8 men watching. The 16th, we've got 6 men watching. So there's still a bit of concern. They're still taking a lot of care that it doesn't get out of hand again. So you see what I mean? We start to get stories coming out of this, which are just really like this. So spending wise, so immediately after the men watching, we've got turns. Now, we don't know what a turn is, but we do see a coat being bought, a pair of shears and needles, etc., making 2 coats, a piece of dowlas. I'm told that a dowlas is a sort of plain cloth similar to sheeting. So, an awful lot of people have been completely burnt out of their homes. They haven't got any clothing left. working tools for Widow Smith. She was probably doing the sewing. Making 2 shirts lower down. So immediately we're spending money on making sure it doesn't happen again or burst back into life, and sorting out clothing for the people who have been affected. Then we've got bread. Well, okay, it makes sense to start handing out bread to the people who have been displaced. Frankincense in the church. Strongly suggestive that an awful lot of smelly people are now in the church. And we'll see more evidence of that as well. Small beer for the poor. So small beer, most people probably are going to know this, but we'll go over it. It's the weaker beer made from the second use of the mash. So it might only be 1 to 2%, but it's, you know, because it's come from boiled water, it's safe, and everyone, you know, small beer was given to kids even in those days. Later on, we do get cleaning the church. 6 shillings and 6pence. So yes, there have been a whole load of people displaced, and the only big building that hadn't burnt down was the church. That entry for cleaning the church was only about 3 weeks later. So in that time frame, they've already sorted out some sort of alternate accommodation for people. What was that accommodation? Well, masons and labourers in getting materials for building of huts for the poor. So we're building huts somewhere. Paid for poles, hurdles, etc. for the huts. Carpenter's bill for work at the huts. Nails at the huts. Beer for the men working at the huts. They get the decent stuff. Lugs for the huts. Don't know what the lugs are. But we're building huts somewhere. So, and I think we're going to see that, you know, these huts aren't just sort of your typical shanty town. They're a bit better. So October the 11th, so we're almost a month after. Paid masons and labourers at the huts, carpenter's bill at the huts, faggots at the huts. That could have been for maybe bedding, maybe fuel, maybe something to do with roofing. Elming, 2 loads of straw at the huts. Well, that could be straw for thatching, or it could be bedding. We've also got nails for the huts, 4 masons and labourers at the huts. Glazier's bill. So we're actually having glass, you know, this isn't some rudimentary shelter. I think the fact that we're using masons suggests that maybe they're getting chimneys. There's our small beer. A bucket and tar line. Well, we think the tar line's probably just an abbreviation of tarpaulin. So maybe they were doing temporary covering of roofs or something like that at the huts. Hurdles at the huts. And my suspicion is they're probably doing wattle and daub, and hurdles a very quick way of doing the wattle. You just quickly tack those to some uprights and then just start getting people slapping on the daub. So we're getting a bit of a shanty town built up somewhere. More carpenter's bills, large poles for the huts. Load of sand at the huts, probably called for by the mason. I imagine he's probably making up lime mortar. Paid air and wild for turns and boards for the use of the poor. Still don't know what the turns is. And Robert Wells for work at the hut. So Robert Wells, we know, is the bell maker, but he's pitching in and helping out at the huts as well. Must have been a real community effort at this sort of point to desperately try and get people housed as quickly as possible before the weather went downhill. Although we don't know what the weather was like then, we know what the weather was like in 1770. And the likelihood is it was hot and dry. So they were probably looking at the weather, desperately trying to beat the onrush of autumn. Then we also start seeing things like this. 2 men appraising the buildings. So we think these would have been men effectively working out the loss that the landlords had suffered as the buildings burnt down. And a man 2 days attending them. I think it makes sense that that man was probably a local man, so he could say, oh, well, that's, you know, so-and-so's house, that one belongs to this, belongs to him. You know, we call this street this. So they were going around appraising all the losses. We will come back to how much they got back. Later on in the spending, we see thatching and attendance. Not sure about the attendance, maybe helping the thatchers. Thatchers getting 15 shillings there. I think at this point, it's probably repairing some of the houses that could be repaired, and also maybe more on the huts. Now, December the 5th, so quite a bit on, first dividend paid at 3 shillings per pound, and they paid out £1,254, 5 shillings, 4.5 pence. So if it's 3 shillings per pound, we can start working out what the total loss would be. And this is where your schoolboy maths comes in. So if the total loss is X and 3 shillings per pound is 36 divided by 240, and that equals 1254.25. And at this point, I started not worrying about the pennies, because trying to do decimal maths with pounds, shillings and pence is horrible. So that means that 36x is 1254 times 240 equals that big number. So therefore, x is that big number divided by 36 is £8,361. 0.66, which works out at 8,361, 13 shillings and 9 pence, or in today's money, somewhere around £1.7 million worth of damage, which is pretty scary. And they're getting 3 shillings back in the pound. It's eye-watering levels loss they're looking at. So, switching back to the fundraising, so instantly we're seeing that Thomas Bigg donates £21. The Good Folk of Minor have donated £6, 19 and 10 pence. Hungerford, £6, 16 shillings, 6 pence. So we're obviously getting the word out to the surrounding areas to get money back in, but that's very quick that they've already got in. I'm presuming Thomas Bigg Esquire was in the village, but they're already go around tapping up the local area, going, help. Now, what you do see a certain amount through the accounts is this sort of pattern: £4, 4 shillings, £1, 1 shilling. And why is that? It's the good old guinea, the equivalent of our pound coin, but gold, and actually had an official value of £1, 1 shilling. So when, you know, the wealthy were being tapped up for some donations, they were putting a hand in their pocket and handing over gold coins, in all likelihood. The guinea had been introduced in 1663 and survived around to 1814. And for those of you who are interested in horse racing, you will know that we still use guineas somewhat when buying and selling horses. Things are amazingly sticky in history. So anyway, guineas were being collected. So our guys going around rounding up a noticeable amount of gold. So we've got entries for here, Shepherd and Bunce's expenses, £2, 2 shillings. So these guys were going around doing the raising donations, and obviously had some expenses, maybe staying overnight at places, you know, it's taken a while to get to places. And this also obviously suggests that they're fairly literate, because they're having to keep track of all these donations and record that they've got so much from this place, so much from that place. And sometimes we compare it together. So we've got an entry for Shepherd and Paris going to Bath, and that came in at £2, 16 shillings cost-wise, but they managed to gain at the same date £99, 1 shilling. So they do, you know, it's well worth paying these guys to travel out to Bath, because they've managed to gather in way more than they spent. And it wasn't just these guys. There was a number of ones. If you trawl through the accounts, you see different names cropping up. So we've got guys traveling out. Sometimes we can even see the routes. So we've got Lambourne, £29, 13 fourpence. Then what's been written as Castbury, and this is what shows it's been transcribed by somebody who doesn't know the area so well. That can only, there is no Castbury, it's Eastbury, because that's between Lambourne and East Garston. So we can see the route that they probably took. They hit up the hill, over the hill to Lambourne, then followed the valley down to Eastbury and then East Garston, and gathering money as they went. They managed to get a sizable donation from Thomas Atwood, the Mayor of Bath. He turns out to be a fairly interesting character. He was the Mayor of Bath when the council adopted his proposal to build a prison. Apparently this caused a fair bit of controversy. He was actually a plumber by trade, and it was solely due to his political connections. He was routinely appointed as the architect, surveyor, and city planner for civic projects. This is way before proper standards of, you know, probity and, you know, not lining your own pocket. So he designed the whole new prison, and that was built between 1772 and 1774. He was probably making a tidy profit after being Mayor of Bath, and could probably afford to give us £15. But he did, so bless him. You get all sorts of, you know, the Lord has given us £20. Berkeley has given us 5 guineas. The Marquis of Tavistock gave us 2 guineas. Then we get the military as well. Lieutenant Big, Major Young, Major Stonehouse, and Ensign Horn. Obviously didn't have as much money, but he still put up. So, you know, they're quite, how you went around doing this, we don't know, but maybe they stood on the market cross shouting, or you certainly do see a fair bit of sign of money coming in back through church connections as well. So certainly there was probably a certain amount of, you know, going, having a word with the vicar, can you put the word out at your sermon and collect up some cash. I think the highest donor is an unknown lady via Miss Ernley, donated £100. £100 is a lot of money in those days. You don't see very many donations anywhere near that. but far and wide, we're donating. You see there, we've got Wharton, All Cannings, Compton Bassett, Chiseldon. We also get Reading. Ramsbury, we're very slow. Not saying anything more than that. Bradford, on Avon, I presume. Devizes, Lambourne, Marlborough, Calne, Bath, Newbury, Cirencester. And you can actually map all of these out. And most of them I can actually trace. And that's the map of where we've got the donations from. We've got one from London, Salisbury, those are the pretty much outliers. But far and wide, and this was before there was much in the way of newspapers. This is one of the big changes between 1760 and 1777, that newspapers have taken off far more by 1777. So we get far more reports in newspapers then. At this stage, it's not so common. And it's, people traveling around, connections, writing to each other. And writing to each other, this is before the penny post. So, postage of a letter from Stevenson House. Well, hang on, we're paying on receipt. Yes, prior to the penny post, you could get charged at both ends, and it wasn't a consistent amount. The penny post was revolutionary, being a penny to anywhere. So here, one letter's cost 4p. Postage to 2 letters, there's cost 11p. Postage to 2 letters, there's 1 shilling and 2p. There's that clock. So you see that postage is very variable. We're even having to pay a messenger to Littlecote. So there's all sorts of spending along the way and things like that. Some of the spending is of a standard of recording that you wouldn't be allowed to get away with in a modern account. To several poor people, seems a little bit loose in accountancy terms. Spent 6 shillings and 6p. Yeah, on what? It's like, you don't just spend. And beer, 2 shillings and 6p. I'd love to see someone getting away with just putting beer or spent into a modern set of accounts and see if they can get away with it. Slightly different world then. So what we don't know from all of this is quite what the location was, although if they were repairing the Market Cross afterwards, we can infer that somewhere around the centre of the village was affected. We don't know where the camp was, where all the huts were built. And we don't know very much about who organised the response. We do know that later on, they advertised thanks, costing them 12 shillings. So then the second fire is a very different affair because we get a lot of newspaper entries giving us detail, although some of it has mislocated it. So Aldbourne, strangely enough, is not in Hampshire. But we know, we sort of know who to blame. Edward Hopgood, it's his house. And then spreading, doing terrible destruction. We know how it started. Terrible calamity arose from a woman imprudently throwing hot ashes against an outhouse. The wind was high at southwest, and then everything caught. Obviously, those days, many more houses, the village has lost a lot of thatch in the past century. Prior to the fires, there were even more thatch. And of course, the thatch, the idea of putting chicken wire onto thatch is obviously a modern invention. So it wouldn't have had the chicken wire. So you've got loose, shaggy thatch, strong wind, fire. It's very much easier to see how this could very rapidly spread. Devastating houses, hovels, 26 barns, stables, granaries, malt house, shops, etc. Corn, a great quantity of hay, malt, fustian, chest of tools, instruments, So this is, some of these things will almost certainly have suffered the same thing back in 1760. We're now saying again, people's ability to earn money is being destroyed very quickly. Other accounts. I love this one. I only came across this. It's from an old book written about the Goddards of Wiltshire that's available on Amazon in their sort of online books. So a farmer at the west end of the village was sitting down to dinner. An alarm of fire was given at the other extremity of the place. All right, he said, wait till after dinner. That'll be soon enough to see to that. Before the meal was over, a labourer rushed to the window and shouted, Meester, your ricks be afire. So this one says it's a strong east wind. Obviously, something's getting a bit lost somewhere along the lines. It's either east or southwest. They're saying that if you go to up the tower and look at all the tiled roofs, you can work out where the ruins were. I think we should, that feels like a little project. We should map where thatch was as far back as we can get and see whether that still holds true. And we get that it was on a Sunday afternoon. This reports back to being at southwest. Question east. So the and so similar lists of destruction. But here we also get there's a committee formed, and I think this is probably what happened in 1760 as well, to actually manage the whole thing again. They've got, unfortunately, a bit of practice here. Already the losses being reckoned at 10,000 plus. They've had donations, similar sort of thing, all sorts of money from all over. Thanks being put out. And we know that the poor being housed in the church, the homeless being housed in the church again. We've got lists of buildings that lost, and harking back to our last talk, we have got the all-pervasive pizzies in here again. They're cropping up a number of times. It's not. We can see the crown inn was damaged, so we know at least one place there that we can still locate. Various houses, barns, and things. And we've got a map. I think John came up with this a while back, suggesting the original extent. And if you've got a howling summer wind that's hot, combined with fire, it's not going to take very long for that to propagate. This time around, we get better presented accounts. They're all neatly printed out even, rather than handwritten. And we get proper lists of the committees, first class, second class losses, very much more detailed in terms of names, but we've lost some of the sort of moment to moment how the fire was handled. So I think we end up with two things that two situations that complement each other. Even 14 weeks later, the malt is still discovered to be burning. That's pretty scary. That's a lot of heat to be still in one place. I think I saw in one of these accounts that they were talking about people who'd been maimed, and you sort of forget that obviously no fire brigades, people were probably trying to haul the stuff out of their houses as they were burning. You know, you can imagine roofs coming down and chaos. And how much effect did that have on people going forward? You know, just managing burns in those days would not have been anywhere near so what it is now, and even now it's a problem if you get a bad burn. There is the beautiful the elegy written by someone who's got a fairly florid style. And yeah, I'm not going to subject anyone to reading it. We have got the whole elegy. But you get a feel for it. The sermon ended to their humble meal with sober step the villagers repair, strong appetite, the boon of health they feel, nor think of preacher, prayer book or prayer. And it goes on in a fairly style that, there we are, is all of its own. On this one, we know that the total value losses now from those account books, £14,000, of which only 3,000 was covered by the insurance, so a net loss of £10,000. We've got a similar pattern in 1760 that they didn't get much beyond, I think it was something like 4.5 shillings in the pound back. So if you owned main buildings, you're looking at huge losses that basically you just had to put up with. In this case, we know in 1777 that some of the better off people were going, okay, I'll waive my share so that it can go be used for the poorer people, which incredibly generous. We know some was held back so we could buy 2 fire engines. And that we think the 1817 fire would have been much worse without them. They're Adam and Eve, and I think that's about the oldest photo we've got of Adam and Eve. So yeah, the impact of these 2 fires, obviously, we've largely speaking destroyed a large chunk of Aldbourne's ability to have its industry and its ability to generate money. And you can pretty much see these as the start of a downhill slide. Through the 19th century, it was a bit of a slightly tired rural backwater, not helped at the same time by the Industrial Revolution happening elsewhere and us not having the transport links. But the fires really did damage the ability of the village to generate its own money. And it's at that point I'm going to hand over to Alan, who should be able to unmute himself. And then I think I've got it set that he can start sharing his.
Thank you. Okay, can people hear me? A couple of hands will encourage me to carry on. Good, good. Bear with us while we plough through this next session. It's taken us right from about 1778 right up to date, but I hope to speed along a little bit. It's not only that we've suffered fires, but also a hint of how people coped with fires in those later years. So following the Great Fires, well documented, and thanks Cassie for taking us through that, especially the 1760, which is all new information we were unaware of a few months ago. But we've got not so much local reports, but a lot of newspaper reports of incidents in later years. And of course, the fire remained a continuing threat. And so anything you could get to hand to help things would help reduce the risk. And of course, in many urban areas, the fire insurance companies provided their own firefighting teams. And if you weren't insured with that company, sometimes they didn't put your house out if it was alight. But in the country, it was very much a bit more of a DIY, pulling on the local population. So as Cassie said, after the 1777 fire, we presume it was bought from perhaps a little surplus of money, 2 hand pumps from Bristow's of London. This is a handbill, an advertising handbill for Bristow's, to give you some idea of what they did. They were quite well organised in London, and they illustrate it with an example of a fire being fought at a previous happening in Cornhill back in the 1700s. And if we focus in on that a little bit more, it might get a little bit blurred because obviously the quality is a little lost. You can recognise something like Adam's fire engine there, with notably the man controlling the hose, which was a solid hose, not the flexible ones that we might imagine. There probably was a bit of flexibility, but it's mainly a metal hose directing the fire to the upper stories there. And another interesting thing is the 2 people on the side doing the pumping And what appears to somebody down here with a bucket, obviously supplying the trough at the end, where you have to fill the tender up with water in this trough, and then the pumping pumps it up to the man at the top, as I say, who directs it at the flames. So you get the general idea. And again, show this because I like this as one of the oldest photographs that we have. And just to point out the sets of buckets here, which were obviously used for topping up the reservoirs under both the engines, and also the fact that the hose inlet is at the top, outlet is towards the tops, hence the gentleman standing on the top of it. Gives you a bit of extra height as well for fighting the fire. So the pumps came, there was a long list of maintenance instructions and to oil the change, the spindles and pivots, grease the axles and grease the elbow screws with tallow. And if the fire's been using dirty water, as it probably would be from a pond or something, you've got to clean it afterwards. And if the pipes become dry, you have to lubricate them with neat's foot oil and tallow at least once a year, and paint inside the cisterns as well. And a whole set of instructions on how to repair the internal valves, because there clearly were valves in there, so that you pump, you don't want the water coming back into the trough, so you've got to pump it up, but it can't come back down. And the full instructions are still with Adam and Eve in the church, displayed in a little picture frame there, if you want to have a look at it. It was still there this afternoon at 4 o'clock, I checked. And the pumps would have been used in the fires in the village and nearby. For example, according to Ida Gandhi, 1793, we had a fire in Baden Street. The church wardens paid out the fireman 6 shillings, which is about £20 at today's value, for beer afterwards at the Blue Boar. And when I say fireman, this was really anyone who was to hand. It was not an organised brigade as far as we know at that stage. I guess it was clearly whoever was nearest and available. If they weren't out working in the fields, the fire broke out perhaps during the daytime, you'd find anyone you could. Again, according to Ida, they had chimney peepers in the village, people who were required to check that the chimneys were swept regularly and keep an eye out for any excessive sparks from the fires, which inevitably were going to be deliberately burning in somebody's grate, but you don't want a lot of sparks flying out the top because the chimney hadn't been swept. Even I remember that from back in the 1950s. And long-handled rakes kept around the village to assist in pulling off the burning thatch. Sounds a good precautionary method. And it certainly helped reduce the risk of fire, but inevitably there were further incidents, particularly 1817 in May, quite early in the year, perhaps for fires. Things perhaps weren't as dry, but it could have been a dry spring. Significant fire again. And this is again where we then draw on newspaper reports as far afield as Salisbury and the Winchester Journal. And as it says there, most destructive fire and poignant distress for the inhabitants. It began near the Smith's shop at midday, 15 cottages utterly destroyed, 3 barns, 2 malt houses, one only recently built at the expense of £500. A large quantity of thrash barley and unthrash, oats, wagons, carpenter's shop, weaving shop. And the poor unfortunate cottagers are left nearly destitute. But the gentlemen of the neighbourhood have humanely opened a subscription to try and make good the damage estimated at that time, soon after the fire, at about £3,000 or £4,000, about £250,000 at today's values. And I think learning from those previous fires, the great and the good soon swung into action with relief committees. Even the very next afternoon, Stephen Neat, one of the leading gentlemen of the village, as chairman, held a meeting in the church, reviewed the situation, provided immediately help for those who lost their homes, and calls for financial help locally. And again, as Cassie hinted, with a much more widespread network of newspapers, it was possible to raise adverts reasonably quickly and reasonably effectively. And votes of thanks were made to the neighbouring parishes, particularly Ramsbury and Chiltern, who sent their engines. I usually just refer to them as engines, but let's call them fire engines, probably very similar to Adam and Eve, I'd imagine. It raises a question of how news was spread. If you're going to send fire engines, then first of all, you've got to go and tell the people in Ramsbury and Chiltern that there is a fire. They've got to get themselves together and get back. You know, it's quite a logistical question to be effective in fighting a fire, which is presumably spreading quite quickly. And they thanked the men who worked the engines as well as other people locally by. And one engine was destroyed in the fire and was going to be claimed under the insurance. We assume that wasn't either Adam or Eve, since they seemed to date earlier. So I guess it was one of the other village ones that was unfortunately caught in the fire. Where in the village did it happen? It said it started at the Smith's Forge, but we're not quite sure whether that was the only forge at that time. But probably it was in that area, because South Street, we know that houses there, and in particularly the need for water for the malting would have been from the brook. So it seems very likely it was somewhere in the South Street area. And within a month or so, subscriptions were coming in. And again, a bit like Cassie said, surprising amounts of money came in. Reverend Birch at Wishford £1, but that's £55. And the Earl of Radnor and the Countess of Radnor chipped in quite a lot of money. May seem a little strange, but Radnor, they had a big house estate down near Salisbury. And a lady chipped in £1, just like, probably not the same lady as the previous one, and a lady at Southampton as well. So obviously publicity far and wide brought in the money. We're not quite sure what happened with the accounts for that and how it was distributed, but I guess it was probably very similar to the previous occasions. Moving on a little, 1839, this time the Aldbourne pumps were called to fight a fire in neighbouring Ramsbury. It's unclear again, really, how these things, because our pumps are principally pulled by hand. There's no particular sign on them that they have traces for horses and things. So again, you've got to communicate the fact there is a fire from Ramsbury. This was during the night time, I think, this fire. You have to communicate to Aldbourne that there is a fire, gather the men together and pull Adam and Eve all the way over the hill down into Ramsbury. Quite an effort. But we get a bit of a clue later on. It's 13 years later. There's another fire in Ramsbury, quite destructive, broke out about 10 o'clock in the evening, raged until 3 in the morning, as reported in the newspapers. The Paris engines, obviously their own Ramsbury and Chiltern fire engines were there. But, as the newspaper went on to report, the spirit of unanimity, which we were pleased to witness, was an exception in the case of the neighbouring parish of Aldbourne, who, although a special messenger was dispatched, positively refused to send help. Such conduct certainly merits the severest reprobation. So for some reason, Aldbourne didn't want to help, which is fairly unusual in this situation. That sparked a comment back from Richard Brown Bunce, one of the principal gentlemen of the village of Aldbourne, back in the following week in the Berkshire Chronicle. And he begs that no reprobation is either merited or deserved, because on a previous occasion, the parish of Aldbourne sent 2 engines to Ramsbury, pulled the whole distance by Aldbourne men, and after the fire was subdued, were returned in the same manner. The authorities of Ramsbury both denied and refused horses for that purpose. The great number of these men, and amongst them a man who is in charge of the engine, has never received any reward or recompense for services or inconvenience. So there was a real gripe about not being helped back into Aldbourne with the machines after they'd been fighting in the fire in Ramsbury. So obviously the parish authorities of Aldbourne felt ever so much disposed again to risk their engines in the same circumstances, and no men would have been found to volunteer their services. All rather unfortunately, this gripe had obviously gone on for a good number of years. That's not quite the end of the story. That was challenged by somebody called J.H. of Ramsbury, wrote another letter back to the Berkshire papers. And again, it does record that the pumps were drawn from Aldbourne to Ramsbury and back by 50 Aldbourne men. So it gives us some idea of the scale of help that would be needed, perhaps, to pull those, quite hard work, pulling those big heavy machines. And it was led by John Bunce's father. And Ramsbury asked Aldbourne to leave the pumps, but Aldbourne refused and left the scene. Ramsbury appeared to have been busy doing other things at that moment. So a claim was submitted to Ramsbury to the insurers to recompense the Aldbourne man, who was supposed to be men who were paid 2 shillings and 6pence. But John Bunce, in charge of the pumps, refused his payment, presumably on a point of principle. And the writer, whoever J.H. was, concluded that he hoped the apparent ill feeling which has so long existed between the two neighbouring parishes will die away and will in future do their best to serve each other. Well, it still seems to rumble on in some ways, perhaps these days just in friendly rivalry, but clearly that was a bit of a problem back in the middle of the 19th century. So it's a bit hard to know who was right and who was wrong there, but it does, as I say, give support to the fact that the machines had to be pulled by hand all the way from the village whenever it was required to fight a fire away from the centre, even into the neighbouring parishes. Though probably, wherever possible, they'd use horses perhaps to pull them back, but clearly not on that occasion. But where were the engines stored? Well, most suggestions and comments seem to suggest they were stored in the church at that time. A bit tricky to access quickly when needed, but nevertheless a central point. And of course, the fire station building, still standing by the green, wasn't erected until around about 1867, when the church had one of its had a Victorian makeover, and they obviously didn't want the fire engines there anymore, so they built the hut, which has got the date on it, next door to Phil Ludlow's cottage. However, fires continued, always that threat. 1856, Mr. Barrett, the baker, his premises caught fire, and the bakers were utterly destroyed, and the pumps attended. Fortunately, he was insured. So obviously that would become an increasing safeguard in later years, particularly for the prosperous business people. 1857, fire in the Woodhouse, James Bridgman and William Birch. That's probably up Oxford Street, Baden Hill, that sort of area. Some fires, unfortunately, not accidental. Following year, Richard Lydiard, well-known name in Aldbourne, charged with attempted arson on 10 cottages in Aldbourne after an old sock was found to be the start of a fire in number 3 in the row of 10. I'm guessing that could well be somewhere like the Butts. Seems quite possible, I would have thought, with a row, because there was ill feeling between Richard and his brother. Sounds a little bit of forensic detective work, just because there was an old sock there, but obviously it was deliberate, and I suppose the finger of suspicion pointed at Richard. And it was the second attempt in the preceding 2 months, and it really would have been disastrous had it not been dealt with. 1862, fire in the daytime out at North Farm. So here, obviously, the farm workers, and there've been plenty of them in those days on the bigger farms like that, and the Aldbourne pumps were pulled out. It still destroyed a lot of buildings, 3 barns, sheds, stables, wheat ricks, but fortunately, the main farmhouse escaped the blaze, and they were insured. Right out at Upham, we can imagine that's a pretty lonely place. If something catches fire up there, it's going to be hard work. 4 labourers' cottages and contents were totally destroyed, and appeals were made to relieve the hardship, as I guess it may have been on some of these other fires as well. 1863, again, risk risky area, a fire broke out in the chimney of the forge, spread to the adjoining cottage, and a great deal of damage was done despite help from the pumps. 1874, down South Street, Neil Farm, as it was in the newspaper, Neil's, we'd call it these days, was initially suspected of being caused by an incendiary, in other words, an attempt at arson, but other people regarded it as accidental. That was as reported in the newspapers. 1877. This is over in the Lambourne area, so why are we particularly interested? But they suffered 8 deliberate fires in 5 days. And there weren't any agricultural disturbances at that time, not like the 1830s, but there was no obvious sources of discontent. However, a gentleman from Wood End, or Woods End as we call it now, George Ingis, was subsequently arrested on suspicion of being involved in at least 3 of the fires. The acrimony between the fire services of Aldbourne and Ramsbury seems to have been forgotten, at least by 1891, but that's 40 odd years later. Hopefully things were better when the Ramsbury Volunteer Fire Brigade helped at a fire at Brown's Farm in West Street, Manor Farm as we call it now, which was started by children playing with matches. Always a risky thing with children, and unsafe matches as they probably were in those days. Interesting comment at the end of the newspaper report though, an interesting sight to see the number of ladies carrying buckets of water and getting themselves drenched in their endeavours to help. I'm sure it's well meant, but you can take that all sorts of ways. Obviously the weather occasionally poses a risk, especially where you've got thatched properties, not perhaps so much of a risk these days. The Lawrence House, which is now number 8, the Green, in August 1900, struck by lightning, which blew down the chimney, crashed through the bedroom where Mrs. Lawrence and her maid were, and set the thatch on fire. But fortunately, nobody was actually injured. Interesting comment here about the longevity of some of these engines. 1902, St Albans and Exeter were sort of vying in the newspapers to who was probably using the oldest fire engines. And then someone chipped in that we were still using the Aldbourne engines from 1778. And the captain of the fire team claimed they were still capable of throwing a jet of water over the highest house in Aldbourne. That's not too extravagant a claim, because probably the highest house in Aldbourne then was probably a first floor, maybe one of the more substantial buildings. And clearly from the views of the Bristow's advert from earlier on, those little pumps quite capable of reaching the first floor of most houses. Even so, the well-known fire engine maker, Merryweather's, suggested to the parish council that they did need a new engine, but were told the existing engines would last for some time yet. This is some 140 years after they were purchased from Bristow, so quite a good value for money, I suspect. Things started to get a little bit more formalised in the 1920s. We actually had 15 men dedicated to be a fire brigade with a sub-captain, and they obviously were called into play from time to time, but even if they didn't, if they attended a drills session, they were paid 1 shilling every time. It probably helped for a few beers in the village at that stage. And Adam and Eve's almost final appearance to deal with the serious fire at the Hightown Racing Stables. That's the ones next to the Blue Boar in 1921. Yes, it was a vicious fire. Obviously, lots of straw and things there. So despite the blaze, fortunately, all the horses were rescued. Lots of the villagers and the attendant horse, the jockeys that were in the village all helped. But sadly, there was a death. The pig in its sty at the Blue Boar was roasted to death. I'm sure they had mixed feelings about that at the end, if they actually had something roasted, even as it wasn't planned. Around about this time, sources, principally Ida Gandhi, that says that Adam and Eve were replaced by a second-hand motorised fire pump that cost £40. Now, we know that Ida didn't always get the story right. I mean, she did brilliantly, scratching around with information to produce her book in the 1970s, but it doesn't seem to quite ring true, because also in 1924, there was a newspaper report relayed through the an article that was written in the Dabchick a few years back from the gentleman of the Wilts Fire Brigade Museum, no less. Don't think it exists as such now. But he said, 1924, useless to spend more money on Adam. Merryweather's had offered a second-hand replacement, but the parish council thought that was too expensive at £45 plus £25, and instead bought a manual pump again from Stratton, which was going to be closing down, costing the princely sum of £17 and 10 shillings. So they weren't exactly throwing a lot of money into fire prevention or firefighting at that stage, even in mid-1920s. However, this following poor, rather quality photograph from the carnival procession does show that it appears as if there was some progress, because the fire engine, not very easily seen on here, seems to have been drawn by 2 horses, at least for the purposes of the carnival procession, when obviously you put on a good display and you dress up in all your finery and your helmets. I guess for fighting local fires, men were still in their working clothes. They would rush round to the fire station, grab the pump and get to the fire whenever. But it did appear as if there was a potential for horse drawn. 1932, parish council meeting reported in the local newspapers. Fred Jerram, he was the fire captain of the brigade for many years, highlighted this difficulty of obtaining horses or motors to pull to the scene of a fire at a few minutes' notice. And it was too heavy. We're not too sure. We haven't actually got a picture probably of that individual engine, but obviously it was not easily handled. So they were thinking then about getting something, and Major Bland suggested a more modern, lightweight Minimax machine, cost about £80, and it might have been a valuable asset. Don't think that was pursued, but at least the council gave the fire brigade some money, thanked them for their services, and Fred Jerram again recommended the installation of some portable fire extinguishers around the village. They were just coming into availability at that time, and Mr. Stacey offered to present one to the council, and I guess maybe others were installed. 1935, we're back again to farm fires. Interesting one at Warren Farm. So we're now down at on the way towards Liddington from Aldbourne. As you go down there, where the Bland's farm is at the moment. Swindon Fire Brigade were called, but the fact that the parish had refused to pay a charge on the rates for their services, the brigade had no authority to attend. So sort of shades of Ramsbury and Aldbourne, but for a different reason. We weren't willing to pay them for their services. So the Marlborough Brigade was called. Presumably these days, at least they had telephones so that you could summon help from quite some distance away. So they called the Marlborough Brigade. But unfortunately, the fire engine broke down en route. So another little bit of a drawback. Meanwhile, the fire is spreading, presumably. The Hungerford Brigade did turn up, but they found the fire being kept under control by the Aldbourne manual pump. So yet again, Fred Jerram's team had got there, got the fire under control, even using the manual pump. And that's again quite a distance to take the pump, so quite how they got that there, I just don't know, whether perhaps they did have a vehicle or something to pull it, even though it's meant to be pulled along by hand. And the Marlborough engine did eventually arrive and they were able to stand down, so all's well in the end. 1937, Half Moon Cottage, just in Castle Street there. Caught a light, early celebration of bonfire night, I suspect. Fire crew turned out, Fred was on the scene. and they still had a job to reach the main part of the roof. But with a string of neighbours bringing buckets of water, the fire was contained, and the Hungerford Brigade turned out on this occasion, managed to get there. 38, obviously a hint of war in the air by then, late 1938. District Council agreed to the parish's request to retain the volunteer fire brigade under the new air raid precautions requirements. This meant that any new equipment they needed would at least be funded by the district, so the parish didn't have to worry too much about extra money on the rates. Shortly after the declaration of war, which obviously took place September 3rd, 1939, in November, the fire bell rang 6 o'clock in the morning. Residents thought that it was an air raid. Hurriedly dressed in the blackout and rushed out to find the butcher's was on fire. Disaster, but fortunately the brigade quickly on the scene, Hungerford Brigade came, and the fire was extinguished. And obviously in November there was plenty of water available from the pond, and I guess that somebody will tell me and confirm, obviously the butcher's was pretty much central to that area, so it was all very, very convenient. A couple of years into the war, important year really for firefighting because of the nationalisation of the general fire services. So all these individual little village fire brigades, town fire brigades were all nationalised under the wartime condition. March 1941, there was a firefighting demonstration held on the Green under the supervision of Major Ingpen, who was the ARP warden. And obviously the voluntary fire service, still led by Fred after all these years, and ARP wardens all took place. And 3 women from South Street, little group of them, tackled a demonstration incendiary fire. Standard equipment was a stirrup pump, a bit like you'd use to blow up the tyres on a car, a stirrup pump, but instead you're squirting water from a pump from a bucket alongside, buckets of sand, buckets of water, and it was a commentary. And they simulated this as a room to try and mimic an incendiary way. And several schoolboys took part in a similar exercise. So it was very much a first aid firefighting for anyone who came across an incendiary blaze. The main brigade wanted to try and tackle a real incendiary device, but the bombs wouldn't explode. Until later, they were placed in a fire. Now, that seems a somewhat bizarre account, to try and get an incendiary to explode by placing it in a fire. But by the time that was done, unfortunately, all the spectators had left. Well intended, but didn't work out quite as planned, I suspect. A bit later that year, the crisis hit the fire brigade in the village. District Council, now funded, had recommended that the engine been sold because it was deemed useless, and it was occupying a shed, presumably the old fire station next to Phil's place, was required for other purposes, and any fires would be dealt with by an auxiliary service from Ramsbury. But they weren't going to keel over and lay down. Councillor Hawkins put up the robust argument to retain the non-motorised engine. It had after all been bought 1924 for £17 and 10 shillings by the parish council, and it was owned by the parish council, and they were obviously determined to keep it. The district relented a bit by letting the engine remain, but it had to be removed from the shed. So we don't know why they wanted the shed in particular, but they obviously did. And the volunteer brigade continued, and they were given a motor fire engine. And the main service was again to be provided. So this is a sign of show of the fire brigade team as it was probably earlier in World War II, outside the shed with what appears to be a motorised vehicle behind, although it's some sort of converted saloon. It's not a fire engine as we would know it, Jim. And the ladies were obviously involved as well. Not quite such a glamorous outfit provided for the ladies, but I guess that they were always regarded as help as anyone who could pitch in and help find the fire. And you can see a better view here of the rear of the engine, which at least presumably had a subsidiary pump and an outlet for the hoses. Not quite sure how you filled it up with water, but I guess there may have been one in and one out type hose. Though it's only come to our attention recently, apparently down in Devizes Museum is the logbook for the Voluntary Fire Service of Aldbourne, covering many years. And this particular page provided to me only in the last week or two via Joe Hutchins shows an account written up by Fred. He was Alfred Jerram, so AV Jerram, Alfred, but Fred, for a fire of an army lorry in May 26, 1944. Interesting date, just a couple of weeks before D-Day. Probably the Americans would have left the village by then, because they left about 3 to 4 weeks before to go down to Devon to be finally briefed for D-Day. So I suspect it wasn't a US Army vehicle, but it could have been. Anyway, it caught fire 11:15, and Fred Jerram and Billy Humphreys arrived on scene. And in a few minutes, they had connected the hose up to the nearest hydrants. It's a bit of a struggle to read the handwriting, so I'll just paraphrase it. Fred and Billy tackled the blaze, and the fire was under control in a few minutes, but unfortunately the tank exploded. Fred was caught in the blast and received burns to his face, neck and hands, and other people had slight injuries. The rest of the Aldbourne crew turned up, and the Marlborough Brigade, and everyone made room for a new motor unit that soon arrived. And it seems almost coincidental, it's in Fred's logbook, that on the same day, a fire motor unit was brought to Aldbourne for the use by the Aldbourne crew and was left in the fire station. So I'm not quite sure whether the lorry fire would have triggered off that reaction from the county, or whether it was purely coincidence. But one would imagine that at that time in the war, the surplus fire engines that were perhaps not needed because air raids had ceased by that time, little risk of being bombed. So there probably was one of these spare vehicles. This would be the old Austin type vehicle. This is possibly not quite as the one that Aldbourne would have gained, but of that sort of nature. Fairly basic vehicle, maybe with a ladder on top and the ability to help out at a fire. Notwithstanding all this modern equipment, as you might say, it looks as if Aldbourne took place in a little rally. We're not quite sure of the location, but it probably wasn't in the village, sometime in the late 40s. And they're very happy to demonstrate how they used to use the older equipment. And here it is Adam, obviously up against the background of display, a row of the Austin type fire engines. And here it is, the lads from Aldbourne in resplendent in their helmets and full gear, full outfits. Again, probably wouldn't be used in a real fire in that sense, because you probably wouldn't have time to don all the gear, but you do the best. And you can sort of tell from the background, this is not Aldbourne. It's somewhere, possibly Swindon or somewhere like that, I'd guess. But it's obviously a rally, and they demonstrated how things were done in the old days, as you might say, or in the case of Aldbourne, reasonably up to date. And here we are, this sort of image of the fireman on top with the hose, very reminiscent of the Bristow's advertisement from the 1700s. So it's remarkable, and the similarity of how the equipment was still being used. So we had a volunteer fire brigade, as some of you will know, until about 1960, and it became one of the last, if not the last, local brigade to be disbanded in Wiltshire. So very reluctant to give up our local firefighting service. And the cover then was meant to be provided by a professional brigade in Ramsbury, and then later replaced by today's voluntary brigade. And although the risk of fire remains these days, the more regulations and equipment are designed to reduce those risks, but still incidents still occur, of course. Only last year, in April 20, there was a barn fire just across the road from Ford Farm. And amazingly, it required the attendance from engines in Ramsbury, Hungerford, Swindon, Ludgershall, Rawwood, Bassett, Newbury and Wantage. So there was a real gathering of fire engines. And a few days later, bales in the same field caught ablaze. So it was possibly a bit suspicious as to what was going on, but nothing more seems to have come of that. And perhaps more significantly, not quite in the same league as the 1760 and 1777 fire, but there was a serious fire even earlier this year. It was the brewery caught fire. That could have been a blow. Fortunately, again, with the modern equipment that came to hand, the worst was confined to the grain store area. But even so, at today's values, £1 million worth of damage and the disruption of the distilling of Ramsbury gin. And here the engines came from 10 stations to fight the fire. So obviously communications play a big part these days. You can call in firefighting equipment, specialist firefighting equipment, such as this one here, to get to the seat of a fire much more easily than it would have done years ago. So there we have it. Things have progressed over the years, still a little bit of a risk. And we hope, of course, that it's minimised and we don't have any further problems. So there we have it. Dare I say it, time to extinguish this talk about fires. And as I say, still a present risk, but hope it doesn't begin to address the devastation which it must have caused to villagers, as Cassie pointed out, in those early years, with livelihoods and properties lost all in one foul swoop. So stay safe, and that's the end of my bit of the presentation. I guess we might take a few questions if there are any.
Yeah, I was just about to say, so if anyone wants to unmute and chip in with a question, Jan's waving, so do you want to unmute yourself? There you go. Right.
I can't see my picture, my image, or anybody else's apart from you, Cassie. I'm just going to try and do view.
Yeah, I'm seeing you. Don't worry, ask away.
Not to worry. I've got a couple of points I wanted to make. Mentioned in the early days, how did they get messages across, you know, to alert people around them that there was a fire? I wondered if the church bells were rung out in a particular method that would have, you know, somebody would have picked up on it, you know, in it, you know, villages in the area, perhaps to be aware that there was a major fire going on. Perhaps that was a message. How they alerted it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you, Alan.
Yeah, I guess that could well work in the village. Not sure about the bells. I mean, unless you were very lucky to be heard miles away, but there was a fire bell outside the fire shed for many years. I believe it was a core bell actually that hung there, and that no doubt was used locally to draw attention and indeed to call the men out to the voluntary brigade.
Yes, that makes sense.
I think in other cases you would have, like Ramsbury hinted, you would have sent somebody by horse to the next village to call them. But even so, still took a little while to get round.
My other thought was the quick response that came, you know, regarding fundraising from locals and local villages. I did wonder, going back that far, whether communities actually had funds that they collected and held for such events, you know, like an early insurance scheme, where perhaps they, you know, in anticipation of a local fire, where they actually collected a little bit of money and held that. And that's why they were able to respond so quickly with donations. That was a thought.
Yes, it's quite possible, although word of mouth, I suspect, did help. But until the newspapers came along, that certainly seemed to be a good way. And there clearly were properties insured in the village, even in the 18th century, as we can tell from some of the details. When I researched the Blue Boar, it was obvious that the owners of the Blue Boar had claimed insurance from the 1777 fire, not for the Blue Boar itself, but for other properties that they held, and they actually were insured. So it was a smattering of insurance as well.
And I think as well, we could certainly see the sort of wealthy landowners in the days before significant levels of banking. They probably had a good pot of cash stuck away
Yes.
somewhere,
Yeah.
so able to sort of chip in. And yeah, I don't think we've seen any evidence to say that they had a reserve, but it's possible, certainly. Anyone else? Julia's waving. Julia, you're on mute.
Yeah, I've done quite a considerable amount of research into fire insurance policies by the Sun Fire and the Royal Exchange, which start mainly around 1773, 1777. And it gives all sorts of amounts that the houses were insured for. The cooks, they get a list of all the things that were in their work sheds, the saw house, the planks, and it gives you some idea of how much they were insuring their premises and equipment for. It's very interesting, and I've gone right up to quite a long time.
Yeah,
and I have given talks on it.
Yeah.
Lovely. Terry, you're waving at us. You might want to unmute. There you
Yeah, only just not a question actually, but following the 1777 fire, the appeal was made by the committee, which we've heard, you put up on stream, which is good. The treasurer of the committee was Robert Wells, and the appeal that was put out on posters, apparently the only one we have to survive it is actually in a frame on Adam, the fire engine in the church, and that poster was found in my great-great-grandmother's drawer in her bedroom, in her dresser, and she thought it was, didn't realize what it was until someone, and thought it would be a place to actually keep it in the church. So it's mine, probably.
Lovely. Paul, you're waving.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Congratulations to Terry for remembering that fire. I knew you had a good memory, Terry. Joe Hutchings very kindly sent me a copy of a Dabchick report about a fire here at this house at Box Cottage. I didn't know if you had that in your records. If you didn't, I could forward it on to you.
Yeah, we'd welcome anything like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I don't recall finding anything like that. So yes, please. Yeah.
Well, the ability of Ms. Hutchings to find stuff is unparalleled.
Indeed, indeed.
I shall forward it forthwith.
No, thank you.
If I can come back again, it's Alan here. I forgot to say, and seeing Beth as one of the people who've been viewing, that at number 10, the green, up in the attic, in the loft area, there are still beams there which show signs of fire. And I think that that's to be found in one or two other cottages in West Street. Now, it may be that beams were reused when houses were rebuilt. Doesn't necessarily mean to say that fire itself, that building itself was destroyed, though it probably was. Number 10 in the green would have been right in the firing line, but probably wasn't a two-story building, perhaps in those days. So it's interesting that despite all that work that was done in 1760, they may well have used some of the better bits of wood that have been used, oak, probably safe to use again, even if it's been a bit singed. So there's a good case of recycling as much as possible. I forgot to mention that in the context of my talk.
Lovely. Have we got anyone else? Can't see anyone waving. Okay, we've got Nigel sent a message. Fascinating, well researched, well presented. Thank you. Well, thank you. Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending. It's such short notice. We haven't made an official decision about what's happening in November yet, but watch out for news on that. We will have to make a decision fairly soon, I imagine.
Okay.
And we will see how we go. But hopefully stay safe, everyone. And yes, hopefully we'll see you in another month's time, somehow or other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.